If I could get close to you, I would use my knife. It's quiet and peaceful, but if you see me coming and start running, then I gotta plug you." That's a direct quote from a man who confessed to 30 contract murders in the city of Detroit. He was not bragging. He was explaining his process. The way a mechanic explains how he changes a tire. Matter of fact, professional. Like ending a human life was just another item on a Tuesday afternoon checklist. Netflix has made shows about every kind of killer imaginable. Cartel bosses, serial stranglers, cult leaders who brainwashed entire towns. They turned Jeffrey Dahmer into a 10-part series and let you stream it while you ate dinner on your couch. But the 8 men on this list are different. These are not kingpins who sat in offices counting money while other people did the work. These are the men the kingpins called when someone needed to disappear. The triggermen, the enforcers, the shadows behind the empires, the ones who walked into a room, did the work, and walked out like they were leaving a Sunday service. Netflix will not make a show about any of them, not because the stories are not dramatic enough, because they are too vicious, too methodical, too close to something that still breathes in the streets right now. This is from number 8 to number 1. Number 8, Stacy Culbert, Detroit, Michigan, 1980s to 1990s. If you drove through the quiet suburbs of Grosse Pointe, Michigan today and passed Stacy Culbert on the street, you would see a trucking company owner, a businessman, a man who hauls loads from point A to point B for a living. You would never guess that this man was once described by crime historians as a killing machine. Stacy Culbert was the #1 enforcer for the Best Friends gang in Detroit, one of the most feared crews in the history of the Motor City. The Best Friends started as a murder-for-hire operation before expanding into a fully functioning criminal enterprise. They were founded by the Brown brothers, Terrence Boogaloo, Reggie Rockin' Gregory Ghost, and Ezra Wizard. 4 brothers who turned contract killing into a family business, and Stacy Culbert was their weapon of choice. Scott Bernstein described Culbert in 3 words. He said he was a killing machine. His demeanor on the street was machine-like, not emotional, not impulsive, not driven by rage or ego, machine-like. The kind of description you give to someone who approached the act of taking a life the way a factory robot approaches the act of welding a joint. Repetitive, precise, without variation. The Best Friends worked for some of the biggest drug lords in Detroit, including Demetrius Big Meech Holloway, the original Big Meech before the Flannery brothers took the name, and Richard Maserati Rick Carter. They were the enforcement arm behind the empires, the reason those empires stayed standing. As recently as March 2026, federal authorities linked Culbert to 13 murders connected to the Best Friends operations. 13 bodies tied to one man, and for decades nobody touched him. He transitioned from the most feared enforcer on Detroit's east side to a trucking business owner in the suburbs. The distance between those 2 lives, between machine-like killing and hauling freight through Michigan, is a journey no Netflix screenwriter could make believable. In fiction, hitmen either die dramatically or get caught in handcuffs. They do not retire to the suburbs and start logistics companies. But in Detroit, that is exactly what happened. Number 7, John Cuff, the Bronx, New York, the 1980s to the 1990s. Before he became one of the most prolific killers in New York City history, John Cuff was a police officer. He worked for the New York City Housing Authority Police Department. He wore a badge. He carried a service weapon. He patrolled the same housing projects where the Preacher Crew would later establish a torture and murder operation that terrified the Bronx and Harlem for over a decade. Nobody knows exactly when John Cuff crossed from one side to the other. What investigators know is that by the late 1980s, the man who had sworn to protect and serve was now the chief enforcer for Clarence preacher Heatley, a man known as the Black Hand of Death. And Cuff did not just switch sides, he brought his entire skill set with him. He used his law enforcement training to conduct counter-surveillance on the NYPD. He knew how detectives tailed suspects because he had done it himself. He could identify undercover vehicles by make, model, and license plate pattern. He knew how informants were handled, how wiretaps were set up, and how cases were built, because he had watched it happen from the inside. The preacher crew had a former cop telling them exactly how to avoid the police, and for years it worked. John Cuff helped Heatley run a kidnapping and extortion operation out of apartment buildings on the Grand Concourse in the Bronx. Wealthy drug dealers were snatched off the street, brought to the apartments, and subjected to acts too graphic to describe. The crew extracted stash locations, cash, and product, and then they disposed of the evidence. The crew members who handled the disposal called themselves janitors. Some of them bore a tattoo, a bucket with a mop dripping in blood, a permanent brand that told the world what they did for a living. When the NYPD could not bring the preacher crew down alone, they called the FBI. A joint task force, the C-11 squad, was assembled. 12 FBI agents, 12 NYPD detectives, 3 DEA agents, 3 IRS agents, 30 specialists, all for one crew, because that crew had a former police officer running their counter-surveillance. In 1999, John Cuff pleaded guilty to 17 murders. 17. A former police officer, a man who had taken an oath. 17 confirmed bodies, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The preacher crew as a whole was linked to approximately 45 homicides, but Cuff's personal count, 17, is higher than most serial killers who make headlines for decades, and almost nobody outside the Bronx has ever heard his name. A cop who became a killer, 17 bodies, a tattoo of a bloody mop, a task force of 30 specialists built to catch one crew that a former officer kept one step ahead of for years. That is too disturbing for Netflix because the villain is wearing a badge. Number 6. Vincent Smothers, Detroit, Michigan in the 2000s. Vincent Smothers was not a street-level enforcer who got into beef and started shooting. He was a professional contractor, a technician. He approached each job the way a military operative approaches a target, with planning, discipline, and zero emotional involvement. Smothers confessed to 8 contract murders in the Detroit area. He used high-powered weapons. He studied his target's movements for days. He chose his positions carefully. He calculated the exact window for entry and exit, and he completed each job with the efficiency of a man who had done this so many times that the process had become automatic. But the case that makes Vincent Smothers too disturbing for Netflix is not one of his 8 confessed hits. It is what happened after one of those hits. In 2007, a 14-year-old boy named Devontae Sanford was arrested, charged, and convicted for a quadruple homicide on Runyon Street in Detroit. 4 people were found dead in a house. Sanford, a child barely out of middle school, was pressured into a confession and sentenced to 37 to 92 years in prison. He was going to spend the rest of his life behind bars for something he did not do, because Vincent Smothers did it. Smothers told investigators that Sanford had nothing to do with the Runyon Street killings. He confessed that he, Vincent Smothers, a professional contract killer, was the man who entered that house and pulled the trigger. He provided details that only the actual shooter would know. The system refused to listen. For nearly a decade, A child sat in a Michigan prison while the actual hitman was telling anyone who would listen that the boy was innocent. The case became a national scandal. Advocates fought for years. Lawyers filed appeal after appeal. Devontae Sanford was finally released in 2016. He had spent 9 years behind bars, from age 14 to age 23, for murders committed by a confessed professional assassin. 9 years of a child's life, gone, because the system found it easier to keep a 14-year-old locked up than to believe the man who actually did the killing. Netflix will not touch that story. Not because the hitman is not interesting, but because the real villain is not the man with the gun. It is the courtroom that put a child in a cage and threw away the key while the actual killer raised his hand and said it was him. Number 5. Chester Wheeler Campbell, Detroit, Michigan, the 1960s through the 1970s. Chester Wheeler Campbell had an IQ of 162. His street name was Dr. Death. He may have been the most intelligent contract killer in American history. Campbell worked freelance, available to anyone who could afford his fee. The Italian mafia hired him. The black drug lords of Detroit hired him. Independent operators hired him. He did not care who was paying as long as the money cleared. In the late 1960s, his fee was at least $15,000 per contract, the equivalent of over $100,000 in today's money. He is believed to have personally carried out more than 50 contract killings over the course of his career. 50. He was never convicted for a single one of them after his first and only murder conviction in 1955. What made Campbell different from every other hitman on this list and every other hitman in history was that he did not just kill. He studied. He was a scholar of death. When police arrested him after a high-speed chase following a traffic stop in 1975, they found the expected items in his trunk: 2 pistols, a rifle, a sawed-off shotgun, heroin, and cash. Standard hitman inventory. But what they found at his home changed everything investigators thought they knew about contract killing. Campbell kept dozens of handwritten notebooks. Inside those notebooks were the names, home addresses, daily routines, phone numbers, and personal secrets of every cop, judge, prosecutor, politician, and gangster in Detroit. He had sealed grand jury files in his possession, documents that are supposed to be among the most protected secrets in the justice system. He owned counter-surveillance equipment that rivaled what law enforcement agencies used. He read criminal law textbooks, homicide investigation manuals, and forensic science materials, not to defend himself in court, but to understand exactly how detectives solve murders, so he could make sure his were never solved. Those notes exposed an extraordinary level of planning. He was the only hitman in American history who was studying the people who investigate hitmen while actively being one. His girlfriend was a funeral home director. Think about that. The woman sleeping next to Detroit's most prolific contract killer ran a funeral home. The implications of that relationship have never been fully explored by investigators. The connection was disturbing. A witness who cooperated against Campbell was found with their throat opened from ear to ear. On both eyelids, carved into the skin with a blade, were X's, a message etched in human flesh. After that body was discovered, finding another witness willing to take the stand against Dr. Death became nearly impossible. Nobody wanted to be the next person found with letters carved into their face. Campbell told a cellmate after his arrest that he was a dead man, saying that whether he stayed in there or got out, brother, he was dead. He died of hepatitis C in prison in 2001 at the age of 71. More than 50 suspected contract killings, 0 convictions, an IQ of 162. Notebooks that exposed a level of corruption in Detroit that took years to untangle. And a girlfriend who ran a funeral home. Dr. Death did not just kill people. He understood the entire system, the criminals, the cops, the courts, better than anyone on either side, and he used that understanding to operate for over a decade without a single conviction. Number 4, Nate Boone Kraft, Detroit, Michigan, the 1980s. This is the man from the opening quote. The man who preferred his knife because it was quiet and peaceful. Nate Boone Kraft confessed to 30 contract murders during the crack wars in Detroit. 30 bodies over the course of the 1980s, a decade when Detroit was drowning in cocaine, blood, and corruption. He was the primary hitman for the Best Friends gang, but Boone did not limit himself to one employer. He worked for anyone who could meet his fee. His standard rate was $50,000 per body. For that money, you got a professional who described his approach as the art of the ambush. He would stalk his targets for days, sometimes weeks, learning their schedules, their routes, their habits, the names of the people they spent time with, and the exact moment in their daily routine when they felt safest. Then, he struck at that precise moment when the guard was completely down, when the target had no idea death was standing 3 feet behind them. His preferred tool was his blade. No noise, no attention, no shell casings for forensics to analyze. When he could not get close enough for the knife, he used a firearm, but the blade was always his first choice. He also carved body parts from his targets after the killings. Trophies, proof delivered to the men who hired him that the job was finished. Physical evidence that there was no need for a follow-up conversation. In a later interview, Boone described his mindset with chilling simplicity. He said, "Somebody pays me to hit you, I'm gonna hit you. Don't get it wrong, I believe in money. Friendship, no. I don't have friends. No friends. No attachments, no emotional connections that could compromise the work. Just money and a knife." But the detail that separates Boone from every other contract killer on this list is who else hired him beyond the drug lords. Gil Hill, a Detroit police official, city councilman, and actor who appeared in the Beverly Hills Cop movies alongside Eddie Murphy, allegedly offered Boone $125,000 to eliminate Richard Whiteboy Rick Wersha Jr., a teenage FBI informant. A law enforcement official paying a street assassin to take out a teenager who was cooperating with federal authorities. The line between the badge and the bullet in 1980s Detroit did not just blur, it disappeared completely. The cops and the killers were not on opposite sides. They were sharing the same phone line. Boone eventually cooperated with authorities. He testified against the Best Friends and other associates. He served 17 years in prison. He is alive today, living somewhere in the world, with 30 confessions behind him and one line that defines his entire career. He said, "It is quiet and peaceful." Quiet and peaceful are the two words you would never associate with taking a human life, and the two words that a man who did it 30 times chose to describe his favorite method. Number 3, Gerald Prince Miller, Queens, New York, the 1980s. 50 Cent said it in one bar on Ghetto Quran, and the streets of Queens never forgot it. Prime was the businessman. Prince was the killer. Gerald Prince Miller was the Supreme Team's enforcer. While his uncle Kenneth Supreme McGriff built the business infrastructure, the supply chain, the distribution network, and the political connections, Prince handled the other side of the ledger, the side that doesn't show up in accounting software, the side that leaves caskets. In 1987, a single calendar year, Prince and the incarcerated Supreme ordered at least 8 confirmed murders, 8 bodies in 12 months. The Supreme Team was pulling in over $200,000 a day from crack cocaine sales in the Baisley Park housing projects in southeast Queens, and Prince made sure every single dollar arrived at its destination without interference. He ran rooftop lookouts equipped with walkie-talkies to monitor police movement in real time. He employed a security force that operated with paramilitary discipline, with shifts, rotations, and communication protocols. If law enforcement entered the projects, Prince's lookouts alerted the dealers below, who stashed incriminating evidence within seconds. By the time officers reached the corners, there was nothing to find. But Prince's most disturbing tactic wasn't his security operation. It was his intelligence network. He had 2 corrupt New York State Parole Division employees on his payroll. One of them, a parole officer named Ina McGriff, was romantically involved with his security chief, Ernesto Pinella. The other, a secretary named Ronnie Younger, was romantically involved with Prince himself. Together, these 2 women fed Prince sealed government documents, home addresses of parolees, false identification papers, ammunition, and information about which associates might be cooperating with authorities. When the parole files revealed that Supreme Team member James Page was working with the government, Prince did not hesitate. He had James Page eliminated. No confrontation, no warning, just information from a government file, a name on a list, and a body that sent a message to everyone else considering cooperation. Prince beat multiple murder charges at trial. The witnesses either disappeared or refused to testify. But the drug trafficking charges stuck. 6 concurrent life sentences plus 20 years. He has been inside since 1993, over 30 years. Nas directed a 3-part documentary about the Supreme Team for Showtime. Jay-Z name-dropped Supreme on multiple albums. 50 Cent built early parts of his career rapping about the people Prince killed. But Prince, the actual trigger man, the man who pulled the trigger while everyone else counted the money, is the one nobody profiles on screen. Because the story of a man who used corrupt government employees to find snitches' home addresses and then had them eliminated is the kind of story that makes law enforcement look as complicit as the criminals. And Netflix does not make shows where the system looks that broken. Number 2, Clarence Preacher Heatley, the Bronx and Harlem, the 1980s to the 1990s. They called him the Black Hand of Death. The organization he built around that name was less like a drug crew and more like a horror movie that ran for 10 years without a commercial break. Clarence Preacher Heatley ran a murder-for-hire and extortion empire out of apartment buildings in the Bronx. His crew was linked to approximately 45 homicides. But the body count is not what puts Preacher at number 2 on this list. It is the system he built around the killing. Heatley did not operate like a street gang. He operated like a factory, a machine with designated roles, procedures, and quality control. He had men called janitors. That was their actual job title within the organization. Their role was to clean up after victims were tortured and eliminated inside Heatley's apartment on the Grand Concourse. They disposed of evidence. They scrubbed surfaces. They handled the physical aftermath of violence with the efficiency of a cleaning service, because that is exactly what they were. Some of the janitors branded themselves permanently. A tattoo of a bucket with a mop dripped in blood, ink on their skin for the rest of their lives, a symbol of what they did for a living that they could never wash off. The Preacher Crew kidnapped wealthy drug dealers off the street in broad daylight. They dragged them to the apartment. They sat them at what crew members called the Preacher's Table, an interrogation setup where Heatley himself questioned the captive. Stash locations, cash reserves, names of associates, Everything was extracted through methods that this platform does not allow me to describe. And when the information was obtained, the captive was disposed of by the janitors. It was an assembly line: kidnap, transport, interrogate, extract, dispose, clean, repeat. Heatley's son, Shaka, eventually cooperated with authorities and described the operation from the inside in a 1997 prison interview that was filmed for a documentary called The Son of Preacher, the Black Hand That Ruled Harlem, a son testifying against his own father about the mechanics of a murder factory. Heatley pleaded guilty to 13 murders. His lieutenant John Cuff, the former cop at number 7 on this list, pleaded guilty to 17. Between the two of them, 30 confirmed bodies. The full cruise count was closer to 45. At his sentencing, Heatley delivered a statement that sounded more like a Sunday sermon than a criminal confession. "I stand before the court, having committed such acts, knowing that water seeks its own level. If you do what you do, you get what you get." 45 bodies, janitors with blood bucket tattoos, a former cop running counterintelligence, an assembly line of kidnapping and disposal, a son who testified against his own father, and a sentencing statement that sounded like scripture from a man who called himself preacher. That's not a crime story. That's a horror film. And even Netflix knows better than to put that on a screen and call it entertainment. Number 1. Wayne Silk Perry, Washington, D.C. From 1989 to present, Wayne Perry has been called the Michael Jordan of the murder game. And just like Jordan, nobody who watched him work could explain exactly how he did what he did. They just knew that when Silk showed up, somebody was about to stop breathing. 9 confirmed bodies as the primary enforcer for Alpo Martinez's cocaine operation in Washington, D.C. Street estimates go considerably higher. During the years when D.C. recorded 482 homicides in a city of 500,000 people, the highest per capita murder rate in the nation, that statistic was never duplicated before or since. Wayne Silk Perry was responsible for a measurable share of those numbers. His method was the opposite of everything you've heard on this list. Boone used a knife because it was quiet. Campbell studied forensics to avoid detection. Smothers operated like a military sniper. Preacher built a factory. Prince used intelligence networks. Silk Perry walked up to his targets in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, in front of crowds, in front of anyone who happened to be standing on the block. He pressed the weapon against their head, and he pulled the trigger. Then he walked away, calmly, slowly, like a man leaving a grocery store with a bag of produce. No concealment, no escape plan, no disguises, just absolute confidence that nobody, not a single person on that street, would say a word about what they just saw. And nobody ever did, because everyone in D.C. knew what happened to people who talked about Silk. The Washington Post called him one of the district's most heinous individuals. Jay-Z referenced him in the song Tom Ford. The line goes, "This is my Wayne Perry flow." Y'all know nothing about Wayne Perry, though. Hustlers in D.C. stopped driving nice cars because they did not want Silk to notice them and decide their money looked better in his pocket. The man did not just control a neighborhood, he controlled the behavior of an entire city through fear alone. His work was described as so smooth that bystanders standing 3 feet from the target would be genuinely confused about how the person next to them suddenly collapsed. He materialized. He fired. He evaporated. A ghost who left bodies instead of footprints. A man who killed the way most people breathe, automatically, without conscious thought, and without any visible effort. But Silk Perry's most disturbing chapter is not about what he did on the streets. It is about what the man he protected did to him in a government office. Wayne Perry eliminated 9 confirmed targets for Alberto Alpo Martinez. He was Alpo's shield, his shadow, his reason for being alive. Anyone who threatened Alpo's operation was handled by Silk with the kind of calm efficiency that made grown men change their routes home at night. When Alpo was arrested in 1991, Perry expected the code to hold. You stay quiet. You take the time. You do the bid. That's what men do. That's what soldiers do. That's what loyalty means. Alpo sat down with federal prosecutors and opened his mouth. He confessed to 14 murders. He gave up every name, every date, every location. And the first name on the list, the most important name, the one that carried the most weight, the one that would bury the deepest, was Wayne Perry. 5 consecutive life sentences, based almost entirely on the testimony of the man Silk had protected with his own life. The most loyal trigger man in the history of the American streets was destroyed by a 5-minute conversation in a government office. And Wayne Perry never said a word. Not one name, not one date, not one detail, not one syllable that could have reduced his sentence or improved his conditions. He took 5 consecutive life sentences and walked into the cell in silence. Total silence. The kind of silence that echoes louder than a confession ever could. When Don Diva magazine interviewed him years later, his words were measured and direct. He said he was a very loyal man. I don't fear nothing and no one but God. Alpo made false statements and told countless lies that got me 5 consecutive life sentences. Make no mistake about it, Alpo is a spineless coward, a rat of the highest order. The trigger man who followed the code, 5 life sentences, still alive, still inside, still silent. More than 30 years of silence. The kingpin who broke the code, 35 years. Witness protection, new identity in Maine. A quiet apartment on College Street in Lewiston. Freedom. But the streets don't operate on the government's timeline. Alpo couldn't stay away from Harlem. He came back. He posted videos online. He rode motorcycles through the same blocks where Rich Porter used to count his money. He bragged on camera. He smiled. He acted like a man who had killed his best friend, snitched on everyone he ever worked with, and gotten away with all of it. On October 31st, 2021, Halloween morning at 3:30 a.m., Alpo Martinez was sitting in the driver's seat of a red Dodge Ram pickup truck on West 147th Street near Frederick Douglass Boulevard in Harlem. Gunshots erupted through the driver's side window. 5 bullets struck him, the chest, the chin, and an arm. He was pronounced dead at Harlem Hospital. In 2024, the man charged with the killing was acquitted by a jury. Not guilty. Nobody is serving time for Alpo's death. Nobody is in prison. Nobody is paying. Wayne Perry is still alive, still in his cell, still silent. 5 life sentences for the crime of keeping his mouth shut while the man he protected opened his. The rat is in the ground, the soldier is in the cell, and the code, the thing one man followed to the grave and the other man broke for 35 years of borrowed time, is the only thing still standing. That's why Silk Perry is number 1 on this list. Not because of how many people he eliminated, not because of how he did it, but because the most loyal trigger man in the history of the American streets was destroyed by the one person he would have died to protect. And the system rewarded the traitor and buried the soldier. Netflix will never tell this story, not because it lacks drama, because it has too much truth. There's no hero at the end, no justice at the end, no resolution at the end. There's just a man in a concrete box who kept his word, and a man in a wooden box who didn't. And the streets aren't asking questions about either one, because the streets already know the answer.